Hello, everyone. Can you hear me clearly enough?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Well, welcome to today's event. My name is Deepa Majumdar, and I teach philosophy at Purdue University Northwest. I'm the coordinator of this series titled Race, Racism, Anti-Racism. Today's event is the first in spring 2021. It's a Q&A by PNW Professor Dr. Lee Artz with 3 leaders of protests against racism and police violence: Aislinn Pulley from Chicago Black Lives Matter, Jae Yates, Twin Cities Coalition for Justice, and Missie Summers, Porter County BLM. Our moderator is Dr. Karen Bishop Morris. I'd like to start with a dedication of this series, which is something we feel deeply about. In 2020 alone, police have shot and killed over 800 people, of whom almost 20% were Black youth, meaning at a disproportionate rate given the race demographics of the US. It is unfortunate that we have a pool of victims to choose from. This should not be the case. Everyone knows of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor because they have made the national news. But closer to home, we have Sean Reed, killed in Indianapolis in May 2020, Rashad Cunningham in Gary in August 2019, and Eric Logan in South Bend, June 2019. We dedicate this series of lecture discussions to their memory and in protest of their killings by police. So what is the purpose of this series? Since the brutal killing of George Floyd, millions of Americans and people in other countries have been shocked and outraged. Hundreds of protests have been held, perhaps the largest demonstrations against racism since the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The purpose of this Zoom-based series, featuring monthly presentations by scholars, journalists, and civic representatives addressing multiple aspects of racism and anti-racism, is to sympathize with the times and current protests against racism, to provide extracurricular education on race, racism, and anti-racism, and to focus on Western racism, domestic and international, especially the African-American experience, while recognizing that racism exists in many countries worldwide. I have many people to thank for this series. Many have made this possible. First and foremost are our 3 guests, Aislinn, Jae, and Missy. I'd like to thank Chancellor Keon and Provost Holford for funding this series. Sue Bremer, Catherine Olson, Dean Carey, Liz Rodriguez and Rachel Pollack, PNW Office of Information Technology, James Seidler and Jamie Eggert, who have helped create our webpage, Jason Jeffers, Greg Collins, our audiovisual technicians. I'd like to thank our colleagues who helped plan this series, especially Professor Bishop Morris, Professor Lee Artz, Kim Sipes, Mita Chaudhary, and Colette Morrow. Above all, I'd like to thank you who are in the audience. There are so many things you could have been doing at this time, and instead you have joined us to speak about this, or to listen to our speakers and our host. Thank you so much for being here. You are cordially welcome to register for the rest of the Spring 2021 program, for which our registration link and webpage are ready. This registration link is different from the Fall 22 link. And as far as technology goes, please bear with us if we have a power outage or any other technical glitch. We are relying on Zoom technology. We hope nothing will happen. I would now like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Karen Bishop Morris, who is Associate Professor of English at Purdue University Northwest. She is a frequent invited panelist and speaker on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and she has received awards for her work on diversity. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Bishop Morris, and she's going to take over here. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Professor Majumdar, for recognizing the Black Lives Lost and reminding us of the importance to reflect and, when possible, to say their names. Good afternoon, everyone. It is wonderful to be with you. Thank you so much, as Professor Majumdar said, for joining us. I'd just like to underscore something that she also said, and that is that the impetus for this discussion grew entirely out of our faculty at PNW, who felt accountable and responsible to the students and the community we serve to shine a light on racial injustice and to create a space for open dialogue on the scourge of violence that dominates the news cycle. And while those early discussions were centered on racial violence in relation to police brutality, our conversation quickly expanded to acknowledge and include the structural and systemic racism that has characterized our institutions for hundreds of years. These issues are complex and uncomfortable, yet we cannot use complexity as an excuse for inaction. Like our panelists today, we have to stop settling for discussion only about these issues, and we have to take bold action when and where we can. We need to find respectful ways to hold those in leadership positions accountable. Over the last week, we've seen leadership through bold action, through executive orders. We've seen the fortification of DACA. We've seen a reversal on the ban for transgender persons joining the military. We've seen lifted restrictions on passport holders to 7 Muslim countries. We've seen a president direct all federal agencies to review actions on racial equity and to report. There is a timeline, there is accountability. It doesn't take years or millions to do what is right. And we know that the time is always right to do what is right. And so on that note, off my soapbox, I just want to repeat that we are recording. And so if your preference is not to have your name or countenance on screen, then we invite you to view this discussion on Facebook, where we are also live streaming. The page is entitled PNW Series, Race, Racism, and Anti-Racism. And naturally, the recording is available immediately following the event on Facebook and will also be available on a PNW channel. We invite you to mark your calendars for the remaining events in the spring series. Those events can also be found by searching anti-racism on the Purdue University Northwest website, or again, following the same page on Facebook. Lastly, it's important to note that the views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the persons appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Purdue University Northwest, the Purdue University Northwest faculty organizers, or others who may be associated with its production. I'll take just one more minute to remind you to please post your questions in the chat. The chat is being managed and moderated, and you don't need to wait until we actually arrive at the Q&A section of these presentations to begin posting your questions. And with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's panel. It is Lee Artz, who is a professor and researcher of transnational media, democracy, and the public sphere. Professor Artz's work focuses on depictions of race, nationality, and the globalization of entertainment. Dr. Artz earned his undergraduate degree in English at Wayne State University, where he minored in Black Studies. At Wayne State, Artz worked with the Black Workers Congress, the NAACP, and the Detroit Mayor's Office to establish an official African Liberation Day in the city. He also campaigned for desegregation of the Detroit public schools. Professor Artz became a coordinator for the National Student Coalition Against Racism in Boston, defending school desegregation with community groups and labor unions against racist violence against Black students. Encouraged by his union affiliations, Artz apprenticed as a machinist in the Steelworkers Union, chairing his union's Affirmative Action Committee and editing the local union paper. After a decade as a machinist, his union contract funded his master's degree in communication, and the rest, as they say, is history. After earning his PhD at the University of Iowa, Artz taught at Loyola Chicago, and now we are fortunate to have him at Purdue University Northwest. He has published a dozen books, many more articles and chapters. He continues to teach and publish on race and class representation in news and entertainment, and we're fortunate enough to have him today doing what he's about to do so well. Professor Artz?
Thank you, Karen. I'm happy to be here. So many thank yous have already been said. I don't think I have to repeat them. I wanted to explain a bit how this panel came about. Following the killing of George Floyd and the mass outpouring of condemnation of police violence, media were mostly positive in their coverage, recognizing the justified response by millions. But within 2 weeks, that shifted to claiming that protests were violent, there were looters, there were rioters, which was a distortion of the peaceful actions. At the same time, the commercial media sought to explain the anger and the motivation and the demands of the millions, but it featured commentary by experts, politicians, editorial commentators, everyone except the victims and the protesters themselves, who apparently voices were deemed not worthy of media access. So this panel, Voices Unheard, is our small response. Our intent is to place the voices up front and primary of those who have organized and acted against racism in their communities. We have the 3 guests today that Dr. Majumdar already explained. Aislinn Pulley, who is a co-founder of the Chicago Black Lives Matter and director of the Chicago Social Justice Center. Jae Yates, an organizer and publicist for the Twin Cities Coalition for Justice in Minneapolis. That's the city where George Floyd was murdered, and that still has an autonomous zone in his name that authorities have pretty much left alone. And Missy Sanders from right here in Northwest Indiana. She's a local organizer of Porter County Black Lives Matter, which has held local actions against racism in Valparaiso and other communities. So I welcome Aislinn, Jae, and Missy. Hello.
Hi.
I thought that we would start with, if we look at the media, it appears that the protests have dissipated, that they've gone away. Why are they not as powerful? Or are they, and the media is just not reporting on it?
Well, I think the problem is actually twofold. The media is not reporting on them. And it seems that the fanfare or the joy behind protesting is lost. A lot of people got into protesting because it was cool and it was trending. And as we stated when we started our protest, this is not something that you can just hashtag and trend for. This is something that's going to be lifelong, and it has to be sustaining. It's no longer popular in the media. We don't see it trending on any of our social media accounts or on our feeds. And as a result, it seems like interest has dissipated. I know for us locally, we still have very, very small movements. We've gone from about 200 organizers and protesters to about 12. And it's sort of disheartening, but at the same time, it was to be expected.
I think for us in Minneapolis, it's actually, I think people also forget that, like, you can't just protest indefinitely. Like, people do have to, like, work, and, like, you know, it's winter here. like people are having to, you know, take care of each other during a pandemic as well. And so, like, there's a lot of reasons why, like, attendance is maybe a little bit lower than in the summer, but honestly, like, we haven't seen, like, a hugely dramatic drop off in, like, protested attendance or enthusiasm. And actually in Minneapolis, unfortunately, we've had several police killings just in the past couple of weeks. So there's been pretty big turnout for those. And I think that there's a lot of, like, momentum here. It's not getting reported on because, I don't know, maybe people think Minnesota's a flyover state now that, like, it's like our 2 weeks of fame from, like, the uprising are over, but there's still a lot of work happening. And I think that it's just people and, like, the news cycle are focusing on other things.
Yeah, I think the uprising was one of the largest uprisings in, recorded history. So I think it's important to contextualize it within that reality. So there isn't necessarily an expectation that tomorrow we're going to hit the streets again with 26 million people without a considerate confluence of forces and events that led to the uprising over the summer. I think we will probably have additional uprisings because the crisis hasn't abated, but they ebb and flow. And so I think there's a logical ebb and flow that is occurring. And similar to what Jay said, Chicago has continued to have protests. And just yesterday we had a youth students from CPS occupy outside of our unelected school board president's house, demanding a safe return or no return, because our school board, which is appointed by the mayor, is, along with the mayor, are forcing students back in school. And there've already been deaths. There already been, you know, infection sites of expanded infection. And so students were just there yesterday. And so there continues to be organizing happening. Some of it's picked up by local media. I think, you know, also January 6th, the attempted coup, or however you're defining it, has also shifted focus, because of, this is also a very historic event, which has not happened very often in the United States. And so I think there are multiple crises happening, and I'm pretty confident that we will see probably a reemergence of some form of rebellion again, as the crises continue to deepen.
That kind of leads to a, building off that, Aislinn, it might suggest that the only way that there's protests or response is when there's a dramatic event like the killing of Floyd that was shown nationwide. So does that mean that there has to be a crisis for some kind of movement towards equality or an end of racism motivates people to act? I mean, embedded within that is also the question of, okay, 26 million people protested. What have we got for it? I mean, some of the editorials in the media and the commentators said, well, you did all that, but it didn't matter, which may take its toll, as Missy said, for people in Porter County. We come out and nothing seems to change, so why should I make the effort? So maybe you could share with us what your assessment is of what was the effect of those historic level of demonstrations and organizations that have popped up everywhere.
I think media often, and pundits often, don't really know a lot when it comes to movement. So, you know, they say whatever, you know, they're gonna say. But I think, you know, the biggest thing that has come out of the uprising is that 26 million people participated, which is humongous, and have that experience of resisting.
That's more than the people that have been infected by the virus.
And that's who physically came out. And we can assume, you know, there's a compounded level of support of people who weren't able to come out for whatever reason. So I think the effects of that we will see in the coming years and perhaps decades. There's experience that people have in being on the street and engaging in that type of resistance that will hopefully be instructive in the years to come. And like, as you said, so many new groups have formed and are continuing to form, and a whole slew of new young folks are being activated, and are like these students who are refusing to succumb to, you know, the dictatorship of Lori Lightfoot and our unelected school board, by siding with the teachers union and demanding safe conditions for return. So I think the consequences are much wider than what pundits often look to as like electoral wins or ordinances or very kind of short-term things, which wouldn't even make sense, right? Because we're really protesting the entire system. So I think that the effects of that will be hopefully more people entering into movement work and really wrestling with the politics and the ideological underpinnings of why US police kill its population at such a high rate.
Right. There's been a trickle down from what the protests have brought. We've seen people get engaged in
Oops. We lost your sound there for a minute, Missy.
Live in Porter County. Well, it's not small, but it's not as big as Chicago or Minneapolis. So we don't get as great of movement as bigger cities. So I feel like we're always going to be behind and lagging. But the great part is we've seen huge voter turnouts. I saw my younger people, I mean, fresh out of high school, registering to vote, getting out there and voting, putting their voice behind candidates they felt that reflected their feelings about racism. So for me, that's a positive move forward for us here in Porter County, being that we're just so small, but seeing that we're creating groups for diversity in our local communities for politics. So Valpo created a diversity, as they want to call it, organization to look into how to make Valpo more diverse and homeless and things like that. And Portage has also created one as well for police accountability. So
We had to miss some of that.
Yeah, to kind of respond to the original question, I think for us, I agree with Aislinn that it's about like movement building for sure, but also in Minneapolis, like I think people genuinely attribute a lot of the changes that we've seen to like the governor or city council. And it's like city council and the governor, like, yeah, they like passed like or finally allowed us to potentially get some stuff on the ballot, like community control of the police. We're trying to get that on the ballot for 2021. And yeah, I mean, they like ultimately approved those things, but they only did it because people threatened to continue to be disruptive and to continue to threaten public property, which like, you know, people can say what they want about rioting. But, you know, I think that history tells us that it's effective. History tells us that when politicians are faced with a choice between public property and doing what the public demands of them, they often choose to meet the demands, at least in some measure. And I think in Minneapolis, it is complicated because I think we saw gains initially just in the fact that there were more people that were even talking about the possibility of community control of the police, and even talking about things like defunding the police. But I think what's disheartening for a lot of people right now is that, you know, it became pretty clear pretty quickly that city council in particular was mainly, you know, using that for talking points and not ever planning on following through with it. And so, yeah, I think that there was a little bit, especially for more liberal elements and like people who were really new to kind of the activist scene, or even like completely new to more social justice causes. I think for them that was disheartening because they don't understand how movements work. Like there's a lot of that. There's a lot of having to continue to push for things even after it seems like there's maybe a victory or after it seems like there's been headway made. And so, yeah, I think Aislinn is right that there's a lot of focus on these like big moments, and like people think that movement work is about these like dramatic, like sweeping changes, but it's usually not that. It's never really been that. It's just how that gets characterized in media often, and in like kind of looking back on it.
Well, it seems like each of you are in many ways are agreeing that there's been a gain in experience, a gain in consciousness, increase in organizing. But that raises a question which doesn't seem that all the responses weren't exactly the same. I mean, Aislinn says we're confronting an entire system, which is different than getting people to register to vote a little bit, I would say. And Jay, you're talking about resolutions so that you can actually have opportunity to have community control of the police. So let's accept that the changes that resulted from the 26 million protests and all of the organizations are not immediately obvious, and they kind of rise and fall, as you say, Jay, depending upon the power of the movement to get the powers that exist to either respond or not respond. So that kind of leads to the question, what are your tasks now? What are the immediate goals that are confronting? Because again, you aren't going to have a demonstration every Saturday. You don't want to wait until the next Black person is shot to have a protest in response to that. What happens now for your organizations, but for the hundreds of organizations that have occurred, have been built across the country? Is that a fair question?
I mean, I think it's like a difficult question. Like, I think that there's always like so many, because we are confronting like a whole system, but it's like you have to, in order to confront a system, you do have to confront all of these like little pieces of it, right? And like for us, like there's so many pieces of it that are like urgent. I think that in Minneapolis, one of the urgencies is community controlled police, but also we have 646 of us that were arrested the night after election night for a peaceful demonstration. So like, you know, if we're too busy and too focused on like getting community control of the police on the ballot, like we're all gonna like have to go to jail for 90 days. Like we have to like do both. There's a whole housing crisis in, you know, the country, but also in Minneapolis in particular. The park board has been really aggressive in evicting people from encampments that have popped up. And so there's a big kind of scramble to try and find housing for folks right now, because who can organize when they don't have a house? Who can organize when they don't have food? Who can organize when they don't have, you know, stable income? Like, so it's like, it's hard because there's all of these things that you have to kind of try to solve so that people can effectively organize, but it's like you can't spend any time like focused on just one thing. Like the crises really do just like keep coming. So I think for us, like we're trying to, I don't know, kind of like be reasonable about what we can take on at any given time, but also recognizing that we don't fully have any choice. Like that we kind of just have to do it all. Like, so yeah.
And that's what we're facing here in Porter County. We're asking our demonstrators and our activists, what do you guys need so you guys can stay involved? And when so many of them are worried about how are they going to pay their bills? How are they going to get to work? Who's going to care for them? These are real questions and issues that we have to have answers for them for, and it does affect the way they help us. So we make sure that we can try to get involved with just anything that we can for the community. If it's food drives, we make PPE equipment and masks for
Missy, you froze there.
That's immediate requirement to improve the internet connection.
They do this to me on purpose out here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I'm the you mentioned in my intro, in addition to BLM, I'm also with another org, which is called the Chicago Torture Justice Center. And it was formed out of the 2015 reparations ordinance for survivors of police torture, largely led by a former police commander named John Burge, who led a torture ring of a very conservative number is at least 120, primarily Black men and boys, but that's only based on who has stepped forward as survivor, and women in GNC and non-binary folks. Survivorship is more complicated. It's particularly as it relates to policing. So the number is actually very much bigger than that. Anyway, I say all that to say that we just did a FOIA of the number of folks who have died in IDOC, which is Illinois Department of Corrections, because there are still over 100 torture survivors who remain incarcerated that we're fighting to get out. And we found out, based on this FOIA, over 167 people have died from COVID since March. And the IDOC website was just brought down last week. The numbers were very difficult to decipher, so we were trying to decipher. We had before that a confirmed total of 10. So that is a huge jump into who we are realizing has been, who has died. And we expect that number to eventually be higher. So immediately in front of us is the demand to free and release all elderly and immunocompromised incarcerated people in detention across Illinois, because you cannot socially distance in prison, and the conditions continue to be horrid, even worse than they were before. So that's one demand on the horizon. And then there are many other demands related to the pandemic. Employment in Chicago for Black people has risen threefold since 2019. And the majority of folks who have been forced into unemployment were service industry workers, which means that they already weren't making a living wage. And so people have been forced into deeper and deeper poverty. And there have been no meaningful measures to help mitigate the economic crisis that people have been forced into. So in addition to a jobs program, we need immediate relief for people who are facing poverty, deeper levels of poverty. We need, of course, paid sick leave, and all of the things that we demanded before, but that becomes even more crucial now. And then on top of that, we need to maintain the pressure on CPD. CPD killings have gone down since we have had a multitude of wins, including a controversial one for abolitionists, which remains an important tension to continue to face. But since we were able to win a conviction for Van Dyke, who murdered Laquan McDonald, murders by CPD have gone down. They have been in the single digits for the first time in probably 2 decades, because we've been looking at the numbers. CPD between 2010 and 2014 led the country in killings of Black people. So that is a huge win that has resulted in people saving lives. And as a result of that, we now have been able to mobilize when police shoot someone and hurt them. Before it was, we mobilized when they were killed. So as much as that is not a win, right, in terms of stopping the brutality and the violence, it is an incremental reflection that the terrain is shifting and the pressure that CPD is under has increased. And so we need to maintain that pressure because the FOP is fighting back hard. So there's a lot of work still needed on the table, not to mention the, supporting the union strikes that have also emerged with SEIU, Teachers Union, and others. So there's there is not a shortage of work to be done.
Well, if I was taking notes about what the three of you just said, I have a list that says vaccines and the protection from the pandemic, employment, police violence, police torture, housing, education. I mean, the list goes on. It's kind of what Dr. Bishop said at the beginning, that there's a system to racism. But that kind of begs the question of what are the tasks? I mean, I don't want to insert into this conversation, but one of the things I noticed is that Black Lives Matter nationally has received millions of dollars in contributions from corporations and corporations. And so it would seem like that money would be available, or there at least should be an organized conference or convention where you can actually discuss these things, prioritize them, come up with a shared, because what's done in Porter County or Minneapolis, Chicago, if it's not done somewhere else, it has a local impact. But to decide to do something other seems like there should be some basis for a conversation. So my question is, you're all more or less affiliated with Black Lives Matter. What's the kind of global national task that faces Black Lives Matter, and why isn't it, or how does it move in that direction? If that's not a fair question, just say so and we can move on.
So we just need clarification, because BLM Chicago, along with right now it's about 20 other chapters of BLM under the BLM name, have publicly separated from BLM National. So we are not officially in relationship with them. That happened, I want to say mid to late December. I can't remember the exact date that it became
what led to that? I mean, you 20 chapters are on their own or forming their own coalition. What transpired?
Well, this is kind of a culmination of 6 years of really facing what you just laid out, the attempt and need to create a national cohesive organization that will be able to unify fights that are in local disparate areas, so that we can function on a national scale and wage national demands and really move the movement forward. And so there are ideological and political disagreements that have always existed, and disagreements around transparency. And for the most part, Chicago received about $18,000 over the course of the last 6 years. And it was for support of our Justice for Families group, which is made up by families who have lost loved ones to police and who themselves have survived police terror, and to bond people out. Like, we had some people from Ferguson who came and were arrested, and they set their bonds at like $500,000. And so we received some money from national, not a whole lot. And we were unique in that many chapters never received anything. So the issue around money also mirrors in some ways, and in some cases, the issue around political strategy, ideology. And so there hasn't been unity, and it really just came to a head. And we were forced to separate. It wasn't really, the intention has always been to try to figure this out, because we don't want to give fodder to our enemies, right? Who are looking for our downfall. Yeah. And so that continues to be a motivation, which is, how can we work this out so that it's not a distraction to the work? Yeah. But we do also, we have been forced to make certain political decisions and draw certain lines.
Well, we could continue that conversation. I could envision those 20 chapters calling a national conference and maybe pulling in some others. But I see from the moderator that we have some questions from the participants. So I'm going to take a break here and let Karen give you some of the questions from the students that are listening.
Thanks, Professor Artz. And Aislinn and Missy and Jae, you should know that people are really excited about this conversation. I mean, you've touched on everything from the pandemic, or shall I say multiple pandemics, the coronavirus, as well as some of the economic challenges that we're facing as a society. And folks are really appreciating your practical approaches and experience. So one question that has come up repeatedly is with respect to police reform. So I'll try to blend these. With protests and fighting for change, one thing that has to change, obviously, is the relationship to the police. So where do we start with police reform? What can an individual do to make sure that they are moving that conversation forward, but also when they find themselves in the midst of a peaceful protest, engaged with maybe violent onlookers, what are some strategies to kind of diffuse the situation and to ultimately encourage police reform and different attitudes around protests?
Yeah, if I can take that question, I guess the first thing I always say is that there is absolutely nothing you could do as an individual to fight police brutality. Like, there is nothing. Like, you as an individual trying to confront a system that's hundreds of years old, that spans the globe, like, you can't do anything against that on your own. The best thing for you to do as an individual is to stop being an individual and get organized with your community. There is someone in your community that is organizing. And if there's not, you can be that person that starts organizing, because collective power is something I think that people are maybe just now kind of realizing the power of, but is still something that's really underutilized. And then I guess I always want to challenge who the violent onlookers are in this scenario. Like, are they white supremacists? Are they the police? And in those cases, I would say that the first thing is to name your enemy. I think that, like, being vague about who is violent at these protests is sort of what's gotten us to quotes from Joe Biden about, like, do I look like a radical socialist with a soft spot for rioters? Like, that's how you get dumb things like that being said. And I think that also, if that's not who you're talking about, if you're talking about your fellow protesters, I would really encourage people to re-examine what they think violence is, and what constitutes as violent action. Like, is it really violent for someone to vandalize a building or steal from a Target, which, by the way, is not part of their community? They have no stake in that Target. They don't own anything in that Target. That Target has stolen from them and their community. Is that violent, or is it violent to steal people's wages? Is it violent to deprive them from housing? Is it violent? Like what do you, I think that, like, the main thing that people in the United States have to do is to reframe what violence means to them and recognize, like, what systemic violence really is and what it's really doing to people, and to stop drawing these divisions between, like, acceptable protesters and not acceptable protesters, and, like, what is an acceptable form of resistance to empire and what's not. So that's how I would answer that question. But I'm sure
piggyback a bit off of what you said. I want people to examine their emotions too. What brought you to this protest? If it's something that you really are against, it's really firing you up as a person or for your fellow person, work with that, go with that, monopolize on that feeling. But if you know you're there specifically just to incite more of the negativity and the negative behavior, then you're at the wrong place. So what I like to tell people is, what brought you there? Why are you here? Are you really here to bring change, or are you just really here to play? And if you're, whatever reason you're here for, I'm fine with. But as long as you remember that these are people's lives that you're playing with, and these people have to go home to real families and real communities, remember that impact that you're putting on that place.
So important. I think that self-examination and being in touch and not just holding others and systems accountable, but ourselves. We also have a responsibility. So there was a follow-up to that that actually touches on Professor Artz's research with respect to the media. Is there anything we can do to get the media to more accurately name, for instance, insurrectionists who stormed the Capitol or white supremacist groups as terrorists, rather than this sort of softening in the media about their violent action versus the ways those violent actions might be portrayed by groups of color? Would anyone like to speak to that?
The media has to call a spade a spade. It cannot keep chickening out because of who funds their corporations just because that's where they get their money. The media has to say, look, this is exactly what it is. This is what we have to call it. And if they get emails from those conservative groups that says, oh, we don't like this, they need to stand with us and say, hey, we don't care. You know, people get so much news and information from so many spots. So it's really, really hard for them to decipher what's real and what's not. So the media really, really needs to step up and be concise and say, this is exactly what it is, by definition, not by what we want it to be or what we want it to look like, but by exact definition.
Thank you for that. So we have a few more questions in the chat, and I'd like to just encourage all of our listeners and attendees today to feel free to shoot a question in the chat at any moment. You don't need to wait until the last 15 minutes or so for our official Q&A. We're happy to take those questions at any time. This question is actually directed to you, Missy, so I'll start there. And it's from someone you know. Professor Colette Morrow, who's professor of English at PNW. And she is asking specifically about a group, IDEA, that operates in the same sort of realm as Black Lives Matters. And on social media, her question is that IDEA styles itself as an anti-racist group, and they actually even work in terms of advising local governmental entities. At the same time, it seems to have a consistent record of defending local entities' actions that most of us would consider as, brutality or certainly racist against African Americans. Can you speak to that dynamic and the sort of ways that they've co-opted some of the BLM messages in perpetuating their work?
Absolutely. So as you can tell, I am not a fan of IDEA at all. IDEA was born because a lot of people in Porter County, thanks by me and a few other protesters, we literally came to our council and said, this is not.
Oh,
Missy, we've lost your audio.
yeah.
So let's come back to Missy on that. There are a couple of other questions, and then I'll turn it over back to Professor Artz. So this is for anyone on the panel. By the way, I've gotten at least a dozen remarks that say this panel is superb. People are really, really vibing with what you're saying. Has anyone on the panel watched the movie American Skin?
Yes.
Okay. No? All right. Missy has. But we'll wait until Missy's audio is a little more stable. We'll come back to that one. So this one for Jae or Aislinn, do you believe the lack of a strong leader, like say a Malcolm X or a Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., is the reason that the African American community and society at large struggles with so many of these issues?
I would love to hear Aislinn's take on this. But I absolutely do not think that is the issue whatsoever. I hear that question so much, and it's always so funny to me because I just don't understand this sort of desire to have this one dude that's the face of the movement. I just don't I don't really understand why that's something that people are really desperate to have. I think that, obviously the Martin Luther King Jr.'s and the Malcolm X's have their place, but I think that I don't know, I guess for me personally, I think that it's deeply problematic to have figureheads. I think that sometimes figureheads do more harm than they do good. And I think that building a movement that really focuses on working class leadership and on kind of collective leadership is going to be a lot more sustainable than like one guy. Like, and it is usually like a dude. So I just, yeah, I'm not really hankering for like a cis, like het man to like lead the movement. Like, I'm just not, that's not really what I'm looking for.
Maybe a cis chick.
I mean, yeah, I guess again, like maybe I'm just too much of a like dirty commie or whatever, but I think that like that collective power is so important to me, and I think that it's such an important way to conduct movements, and I think that it is more sustainable. But I would love to hear Aislinn's take.
Just point out that they were both assassinated.
Right, that too. Like,
sorry.
Danger in being a symbol of a movement.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an anachronistic framing, and I think it's also a victim blaming framing, because it's saying, why hasn't the Black community produced this person to help them, as opposed to why are the conditions so brutal, and why does the system keep torturing and killing us? That's the better question. But I think, you know, one, as Lee reminded us, they were assassinated along with a whole slew of other folks. And so there is some learning there, right? There's some movement learning into how can we avoid, to the best of our abilities, some of what we know had happened during the last iteration of the Black freedom struggle, which were assassinations and frame-ups and throwing us into cages, many who still remain incarcerated today. And so I think there's that, and I think technology has shifted. There's a democratization of the ability to get our stories out, which means that we don't need to have, because Malcolm X was Minister of Media, or I can't remember the actual term for the Nation of Islam. While we may have, you know, spokespeople, and we certainly do at specific actions have people who will take up media liaison, we don't have that same structural need, which is what was needed during the Civil Rights Movement because of the monopoly on just television. On access to media. So there's the literal technological advances that have democratized our ability to communicate, as well as the learnings, the movement learnings that we are desperately trying to integrate. And we've seen media attempt to do that. They tried to do that with D. Ray out of Ferguson, which was a disaster. And he was not representative of Ferguson. He wasn't from Ferguson. And he was from Teach for America, who didn't reflect the politics on the ground. So we still see those attempts being made because it's easier for dominant media to just have one person that they can create a celebrity out of than really contend with the complexity of the movement.
It also gives them someone to blame at the end of the day too. If it fails or it doesn't go the way they want, they can identify that one single person and say, well, this is why it didn't work. So.
Right. Missy, your audio's clear now, if you'd like to circle back and just pick up those thoughts on IDEA.
Well, IDEA was born because of residents here. We needed accountability, and they have the exact wrong idea. It's frustrating for me because we were promised certain things. We were promised transparency. We were promised representation. We were promised accountability, and we don't get those. And it's like, well, we'll get to it. Just give us a moment. We'll get to it. Just give us a moment. And we're constantly being told that, and we're not moving forward with it. So I've abandoned ship with IDEA way in the beginning because it's just not representing what the city is asking for. It's just something that they did to make themselves feel good in the moment. And politically, now that the Porter County has shifted red, I see exactly why they did it. It was just to make their residents feel better, to say, oh, well, it's not happening here in our county. This is a Chicago thing. This is a Minneapolis thing. It's not a Porter County thing. So we're going to create this group to say, oh, we're going to respond to it, but we're not going to reflect it.
Thank you for that. Professor Artz, I leave it to you. Would you like to continue with the Q&A in the chat, or?
Well, if you have some that that are urgent or repeated, it seems like it might be something that the students or others are really want to have discussed.
Okay.
I have a question which may be circling back to something that I asked before, and there may not be a clear answer absent a, I would argue, a national discussion. But like, what's the way forward? How will the demands for justice or equality be given power so that, right? I mean, Jay talked about the city. I remember the city council of Minneapolis said, we're going to abolish the police. And then everybody went home and they said, oh, we didn't mean that. And they did something else. And there's this pushback even to defund the police. Like Biden says, I'm not defunding the police. I'm going to give more money so that they will learn to be nicer. So, and I don't expect the three of you to solve this problem in this conversation, but it seems to me there may be different ways of identifying what are the most potential avenues towards pushing the demands forward for lack of a better term, racial justice, you know, opportunities to end the system as it is currently structured. I mean, on the one hand, there's these incremental reforms like Jay mentioned. On the other hand, I would say what the social movements that sometimes are reduced to Malcolm and Martin Luther King were able to accomplish. So I don't know if that's an abstract enough question for you to respond to. I'd like to hear it for one. What way forward? Or what are the options that are of the way forward?
I think I honestly, I don't think that there's like there's a single like overarching thing that we have to like do right now, other than I think consolidating movement power. And I think that like looks like a lot of different things. And I think one of the challenges to that, like, I think that there are a lot of, in a way, like, obviously Biden defeating Trump is a good thing, but like, I think that in so many ways it's going to make things harder, because not only is Biden like the most like conservative Democrat that they could have picked to have the seat, but I think that white people in particular, they're already getting complacent. They're already kind of like sitting back like, yeah, we have like this progressive president. Yeah, we have Kamala Harris, who is a Black woman. She's the first Black VP, like, you know, representation, like that's good, right? And like a lot of us are like, no, not really, because like Kamala Harris, at the end of the day, she's a cop. Like, she's a former cop. Like, what am I supposed to be excited about someone who jailed people, Black people, for marijuana possession and truancy? Like, what am I supposed to be excited about when those are the people in power that are just as warmongering, that are just as inconsiderate about the environment unless it's making them money? Like, what is there to look forward to from that administration in forms of systemic change? And I think that like, this is really the time when we have to be doubling down, when we have to be like increasing the pressure. But I think a lot of white people just want things to go back to normal. They just want to, like, you know, feel good about having elected such a progressive, you know, body of people to lead the country now. And like, you know, finally the dark days are over. We're like, you know, I think that state repression is going to be a lot more intense under Biden. And so we really just have to start preparing for that, and start really pushing forward our demands for things like community control, and honestly for things that seem a little bit less related, like not sending teachers back to school right now. Like, I think that like we have to try to protect people so that they can continue the fight, honestly, because it's like just starting and there are already people trying to drop out of it. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Jay. And I think now is an opportunity to and hopefully the movement will do this, is further deepen the left movement and building a strong left, which means deepening into what does it mean to be an anti-capitalist, and to assert that on a broad scale and understand the correlation between police is not absent of capitalism, it's because of capitalism. They're operating how they are designed to operate. And I think juxtaposed with where, in my opinion, the left has often really been weak in the United States, is understanding the racial project of the United States and the interplay there. And so we've seen the rise of DSA nationally as one, which are, social democrats, which are not, I mean, there's many tendencies amongst the left. And I think we need to see more, more tendencies. And I hate to be like so general, right? But just more working class organization, conscious working class anti-capitalist organization that really begins to deal with what are we fighting for? We know what we're resisting. What does it mean to build an abolitionist future, an anti-capitalist future? So that we can actually prepare to create that. I think right now our movement has been really strong in the defensive because we have had to. And we need to move now to struggle to fight for the wins in abolishing the entire system. What is it? What do we mean then by that?
I wonder what the potential is for kind of a new Black Lives Matter. What is the potential for these 20 organizations that have said, we need more coordination, we need more focus on the immediate needs of the community, we need more clarity on building a national movement, to have a conference and move from that? Is that something that enters into the, I mean, Jay's talking about the consolidation of the movement. It would seem something like that, Aislinn, if you're talking about this, that kind of thing would be a poll that actually could give rise to some support from the Chicago Teachers Union or the teachers in Minneapolis or Valparaiso, because there would be a poll that said, here's our demands, here's what we want, here's what we're saying is the focus for the next 3 months. Which doesn't mean you don't respond to immediate issues like, a police attack in Chicago or something, or in Valparaiso. But
yeah, that would be great if like a new iteration of BLM could emerge that has a real class consciousness and,
well, to what extent is that, is there a pushback with that?
I don't know that there's pushback. I think that's the goal, really. The goal is to be able, I mean, we're working on creating what is that infrastructure. So there's that is the goal. But I also think maybe the next iteration of movement won't be a BLM kind of thing. Maybe it will be consciously anti-capitalist in name. Maybe it'll be some kind of socialist configuration or workers, configuration that is able to integrate in some of that. But I don't know. I mean, the goal, of course, is for us to consolidate and be able to do that.
The pushback that I was referring to would be pushback from the larger population that is, as Jay said, is relieved that Trump's gone and that you have to work within the system. And why would you want to form something like Aislinn or Jay's talking about? Why would that be necessary? I mean, certainly conditions on the ground might compel people to look at that. I mean, I know the majority of 20-somethings are more in favor of socialism than capitalism. At least that's what the Harvard poll showed. But there still would be huge pushback to say, well, you should get registered, you should run for office, you should get on the city council. Look, we got a Black mayor in Chicago, Atlanta, we're moving forward. So how do you answer that? when lives are at stake. Like, you know, why wouldn't we look for some reform so the CPD is killing fewer people? That's progress.
Yeah,
I don't know if I'm overstating this or not, but.
Well, I think that like that's really just identity politics though, right? Like I think that like that's the real challenge is like we have to move beyond that of like it's not enough to have a Black police chief. It's just not, because that police chief is still a capitalist and he's still in service of like the larger capitalist project because he's a police officer. That like we have to get away from this idea that like the problem is just that the police are racist. The problem is that the police exist and that they are a tool of social control. And that is all that they are for. Like they literally exist to keep workers and other people that support the upper class in line. That's why they exist. And as long as that is.
So would you be opposed to having more Black cops?
Yeah, I am absolutely opposed to having more Black cops. I don't like the tear gas doesn't sting any less when it's shot by a Black man. It means absolutely nothing to me to have a Black police chief in Minneapolis. It means absolutely nothing to me that we have a Democrat as our governor, because that same Democratic governor is the one who authorized the overwhelming force that we experienced on November 4th. Like he kettled a bunch of students, elderly people, union reps. He kettled us on a highway for over 5 hours to teach us a lesson. That's what progressive identity politics gets us. It doesn't get us anything that we actually want or need. And so I think that like our main challenge is convincing people that like identity politics is not enough, that like we have to have actual representation politically. And that means that there has to be like a strong, like Aislinn was talking about, there has to be a strong, actually left, like political element in our country. Because right now, what we have is centrists who are not leftist at all. They're literally just centrists. And then we have like far right. Like those are our two options. And that's just not like, we can't continue as a country that way.
Well, we have about less than 10 minutes, and I'm sure there's some more chat questions. So I'd like to ask Dr. Bishop if she has a couple more questions that she can give you guys as we move towards the end of this.
Absolutely. And also an exclamation point for that last sort of exchange linking tokenism to capitalism is being highly praised in the chat. So thank you for that discussion. So a question about Black Lives Matter activists working with law enforcement. In Lake County, Indiana, BLM activists are trying to pressure the county prosecutor about killings by police. He's taken over a year to return decisions on cases like Rashad Cunningham and Melvin Bowler and Gary. What experiences have the panelists had in addressing the power of prosecutors?
Prosecutors don't like to answer us. We have phone banks, we continue to call on a regular basis, and we get the same standard reply. We'll get back to you, we'll get back to you. So keeping the pressure on them to keep these names at the forefront for them is our biggest concern locally here.
Great. Just sort of a follow-up, what is the priority so that BLM doesn't become stagnant? Is there sort of a set of priorities? Where should folks be focusing locally in terms of BLM activism?
I would honestly say that like people should focus less on like joining like a BLM chapter and really just looking at whether like there's other local organizations that you can look to. And I think that there are local organizations that if you are part of like if you have a BLM chapter that is kind of problematic and like hasn't been sort of in line with the rest of BLM, like there's other options. Like you don't have to become a member of a BLM chapter. Like TCC4J is not affiliated with BLM. I mean, we work with people that are in BLM. We have a couple of members that are also in BLM, but there's a lot of coherent kind of movement building happening here that is kind of beyond that almost identity politic of like, well, Black Lives Matter, so it must be good. Like you have to do an actual evaluation of what the group is doing in the community and then base your decision to join or not on that.
And that's what I tell people here, that, you know, just because you see BLM in a name doesn't mean it's aligned with BLM principles. Yeah. So don't be afraid to challenge that. And if you don't like what you see, start your own group. You don't have to have BLM behind your name to feel like you're doing something about it. Go do it yourself. Get started.
So this question, and then for any of the panelists, any and all of the panelists, and then one final question from the chat that is actually directed at all of the panelists. So this next question is, in response to the January 6th storming of Capitol Hill, the insurrection, have you already observed any shift in the public perception around protests since that January 6th event? And if so, what?
I think that the rhetorical strategies have maybe changed a little bit. I don't know. I have really mixed feelings, because on the one hand, like, I am not a fan of the US empire. And so, like, I did not care that, like, people's, like, offices got vandalized. Like, I was like, you know, like, who cares about Nancy Pelosi, you know? But, like, I think, though, that it's unfortunately going to spark a lot of, it's going to be like the Patriot Act 2, I think, that it's going to be an excuse to also criminalize our protests. And so I think that there's been sort of a bracing for that. But I do think that it has at least exposed white supremacists as what they are, and has kind of made their, it's kind of showed their hand, I guess. And so I think that there are a lot of people that maybe were kind of sucked into that, and aren't so far in, that were able to get out as a result of that. So that's nice. But I think, unfortunately, it's going to be it's gonna be a challenge, I think, in criminalizing protests, and there's already state laws that are doing that in kind of unprecedented ways.
As long as we continue to make this distinguishing between what good protesting is and what bad protesting is, what a good protester looks like versus a bad protester, we're going to keep having this conversation.
Okay. Last question from me, and then I'll toss it back to Professor Artz and the panelists. At what age, this is for all of you, did the speakers become involved in their fight for social justice? How old were you? And what was the spark? Was there one particular situation that sort of woke you up? Was it some experience that you observed from family or friends or the community? What was it?
I can go. I mean, I call it my communist transformation, like, probably began when I was like 19, because I had just come out. I had just kind of gotten like excommunicated from my family. I was working. So I was kind of like developing this like new class consciousness. I was going to school for like feminist studies. So really, like, it just kind of happened from there. But I think that this past summer is really the first time that I have been kind of more than a participant, I think, in activism. I think that there's being an activist, and then there's kind of participating in a movement. And I think that I've been participating in the movement for a while, but like, I don't think that I would have called myself an activist until last year. But yeah, I mean, like, it's never too late to start like being radicalized against US empire. To me, like, you gotta like read the Communist Manifesto, like read some Judith Butler, like read some Donna Haraway, like just go nuts. Like, yeah, that's my advice.
Write that down. You got a t-shirt, go nuts. I like that.
Yeah, go nuts.
Protesting for me started when I was really young. I'm of Lakota descent. For anyone else, the government likes to call it the Sioux Nation. I remember distinctly being very young, going with my mom to Governor Tommy Thompson's home and protesting against welfare reform. There was a great picture of me as a little kid mooning the governor's mansion, and I was like 5 years old. So it's.
See, now we get to the juicy stuff at the end, right?
Similar to Missy, I grew up in movement, so it's oh, now we can hear you.
I'm so beyond over Comcast. I've been fighting with them for 2 days now with my Wi-Fi connection. It's been bizarre. But yeah. But yeah, I've been acting since I was a little kid. There, I said it. I'm good.
Yeah, so it's very similar to what Missy shared. My parents have been, I have been in the movement since before I was born, and brought me to actions, and had to sit in really boring meetings as a kid, and vowed that I would never follow in their footsteps. And then I became like pretty active as a teenager in local fights, immigrant rights stuff, the Fights Who Stayed, the execution of Mumia, Cuba solidarity work. I was on brigades there and had my passport seized. And so I had to fight to get my passport back. That politicized me at 14 years old. And then I kind of stepped away, did like art stuff. And then when 2000 hit, we had Oscar Grant killed, Amadou Diallo before that, the brother out in, I forgot his name, who was executed out of Atlanta. I can't remember his name right now. The fight to stay his execution, which failed. And then we had Troy Davis, that's his name. And then Tamir Rice happened, and then Rekia Boyd happened in Chicago. And then in 2014, Dominique Franklin was tased to death by CPD in May of 2014, and we formed a group called We Charge Genocide. And then Rashad McIntosh was killed that year, and then Deshaun Pittman was killed that year, and CPD knocked over the candles at the vigil and arrested the mom and the sister and the aunt, and we had to fight for like over a year to get some of them out of pretrial detention, which birthed the creation of the Chicago Bond Fund, which I should announce, we became, as of about a week and a half ago, the very first state to abolish money bail and pretrial detention.
Wow. Yes.
And so I say all that to say, like, the confluence of murders and torture and all of that brought me back in. Like BLM Chicago was created because I took a bunch of youth down to Ferguson, tried to get them back into the other orgs that like Jay was talking about, and was like, hey, I'm in We Charge Genocide, come to our meeting, go to BYP, go to these other groups that are doing, let's not reinvent the wheel. And they insisted, no, we were activated together, we need to organize. And so we created BLM Shy. And so it was kind of just feeling like there was no choice, and having to figure out what to do with that rage and injustice.
Powerful, powerful personal testimonies. Thank you all for that. And again, just extensive gratitude in the chat from students and staff and faculty who are participating, community members. Very grateful for your contributions today.
Yes, I'd like to thank what looks like we're at the end of our time. So Aislinn, Jay, and Missy, thank you for joining us. I hope that you, well, I know that you'll continue your work. I just hope that this conversation has encouraged and inspired the participants in this panel to also do that. I think one thing Aislinn pointed out is there's no escape from the inequality that we face. Some people can hide temporarily, as Jay said earlier about ally fatigue. But many people have no place to hide because of how the positions we are in this society. So, and it can't be resolved individually, which is one of the impetus for this very panel, that we needed several voices to be able to express what's happening in this country and possibilities for going forward. So again, I applaud you. I thank you. And I'm sure we'll talk again. And we will, perhaps when we post the recording, Karen, we can give the email contacts for each of the panelists here so that the students that want to can continue a conversation and maybe begin their own actions in their local areas. So
that would be phenomenal. Thank you again. I would just like to share my screen if I can to remind us of some of the upcoming presentations. We have a panel discussion again next month. It's actually next week on World Cancer Day, February 4th, where we'll have guests from Access Community Health, which is one of the largest federally qualified health community networks in the state of Illinois, as well as we'll have some feet on the streets, as well as a local breast cancer advocate and nonprofit executive director, followed in March by Dr. Nadia Brown, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at Purdue University West Lafayette, and author of the book, Sisters in the State House. And then our very own Professor Meeta Chowdhury, Professor of English, who will offer some reflections on the 1619 Project. That will be the final installment of our spring series on Monday, April 19th. Same time, same Zoom room. Thank you again for everyone, our distinguished panelists, as well as Professor Artz and all of the folks who were so generous with their time to log on today and listen. Thank you very much.
thanks, guys.